Hello, and thanks once again, everyone, for joining us for this Wednesday's edition of Alaska Weather. I'm meteorologist David Percy. Up first, we've got on the hazardous weather graphic, high wind warning continues for St. Lawrence Island and the Bering Strait coast until 3 p.m. Thursday for winds gusting to 70 miles per hour in those areas. And then same thing for the northern Seward Peninsula coast, Shishmaref, and the northwest coast there. High wind warning also, but that's until 9 p.m. this evening, Wednesday evening, and that's for, again, winds gusting to 70 miles per hour. And then high wind warning for the western Arctic coast for winds gusting to 70 miles an hour, and that's out tonight until 9 p.m. tomorrow evening. And then there's a high surf advisory out for the western and central Arctic coast until 3 p.m. Friday, and that's for high surf and possible beach erosion with surf washing up to the top of the beaches there. And then for the eastern or northeastern Brooks Range, that winter weather advisory holding there still out until 5 a.m. Thursday, so through tonight, and then should be over by tomorrow morning. And that's for south winds gusting to 40 miles per hour, resulting in blowing snow, and that'll reduce visibilities to a half mile or less, but that's mostly near the passes of the northeastern Brooks Range. And from there, taking a look at weather spotter training, and join the National Weather Service Anchorage Forecast Office and the Anchorage Office of Emergency Management for a virtual webinar. This training will provide information focused on what winter weather, safety, and preparedness, and how to submit a weather report. And this is Thursday, November 17th at 6:30 p.m. tomorrow. And what is a weather spotter? Well, spotters are eyes on the ground volunteers that help meteorologists by observing and reporting impactful weather in their community, and weather spotters have been a great help to Weather Service Forecast Office for quite some time. And again, that's 6:30 p.m. tomorrow evening. And next panel here showing preparing for winter ice flood hazards. Get an insurance checkup. Check with your insurance agency before ice breakup season. And remember that flood insurance must be obtained separately and will take 30 days before the policy becomes active. Visit floodsmart.gov for more information. And let's see, or weather.gov/safety/flood. Either one of those websites will give you more information. And from there, taking a look at getting caught outdoors in a winter storm. Well, first thing to do would be to find shelter, obviously. If there's no shelter, build a lean-to. And if you don't have the materials around to build a lean-to, then dig a snow cave for protection. And, of course, build a fire for heat. And then cover exposed body parts. Pretty much common sense steps here to follow. And try to stay dry. Definitely stay dry. That's a big... I can't stress that more. And then this will help protect against hypothermia. And then melt snow water before drinking water. Avoid eating unmelted snow, which can lower the body temperature to deadly levels. And exercise occasionally. And then the best thing to do is know before you go. Avoid being caught in a storm by checking the forecast before venturing out. And for satellite imagery, a lot of clear skies with some varying clouds there over central and southern Alaska, mid and high level clouds moving eastward across the northern interior as well as the Arctic coast, and that frontal system out to the west really weakening, actually getting pushed back from the west from a position it was yesterday and overnight last night due to easterly flow and a strong high pressure area ridging westward there, even though the centers are starting to slide off to the southeast. And that front kind of pushing eastward there across the central Aleutians. Looks like the back edge of that front now near or past Atka Island. That colliding with some moisture sliding northwestward there. Some clouds and maybe a little bit of shower activity eastern Aleutians up toward the Pribilofs or just to the east of the Pribilof Islands there. That coming around that breaking off from that system that's well south of the Alaska Peninsula. But that did bring a surge of rainfall across Kodiak Island and some light rain over the Alaska Peninsula with cloudy skies today. Cleared out over the Panhandle with increasing winds, mostly sunny down that way, just some variable clouds here and there, but generally definitely dry conditions there for the Panhandle. Winds starting to pick up, especially in Lynn Canal there and Glacier Bay areas. But the interior, high pressure ridging in from those strong centers over the Northwest Territories of Canada, ridging westward. And again, that pushed that band of moisture back to the west over the northern Bering Sea there and directing it northeastward, just barely clipping the western Arctic coast there. Just very light precipitation amounts, if any, occurred at all. Big thing was the strong winds. Let's see. Cape Lisburne had a peak wind gust today of 96 miles per hour. Tin City, 62 miles per hour, and Point Hope about 60 miles an hour. And I believe winds gusted close to 45 or 50 miles an hour around Kotzebue, with lighter wind gusts on down to the south there, more southeasterly across the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island. Just 10 to 20 miles an hour over Kodiak Island, but they did pick up about a third of an inch or 3/10 of an inch of rain in the last 12 hours. And then that front out to the west stalling over the central Aleutians there, that brought roughly about half an inch of precipitation today to Adak and Atka. Otherwise, for tonight, that trough kind of hangs up there along the Aleutian Range, Alaska Peninsula, and so rain, fog, drizzle continues Kodiak Island, probably becoming a little lighter and more intermittent after midnight and toward morning, with shower threats across the Alaska Peninsula. Front continues to weaken as it edges eastward, but should hold together enough to bring a chance of rain into the Unimak Island area, probably dry for Unalaska Island. Look for periods of light rain, fog, drizzle for the Pribilof Islands, as well as the southwest coast, and just a chance over the inland areas there. And then rain or snow up across the St. Lawrence Island area into the Seward Peninsula. Again, pretty light. Most of the moisture back to the west, but probably heaviest amounts would be over St. Lawrence Island. And a chance of snow or blowing snow for the western Brooks Range, northwest coast, and the high wind warning continuing through tonight there for the Bering Strait up to the western Arctic coast, with dry conditions there. And mostly clear over the Panhandle with strong winds out of Lynn Canal, and dry over the eastern interior tonight with light winds. And for tomorrow, much like today, south central Alaska and the eastern interior, partly to mostly sunny or clear. Maybe some low clouds lingering in the Yukon Flats area throughout the next actually couple of days there, with the light wind conditions, the higher pressure warmer air aloft, creating a temperature inversion in that area. So that'll be maybe see a lot of lower flying conditions in over the Yukon Flats area, but pretty good elsewhere, especially down toward the North Gulf Coast. Risk of a shower, Kodiak Island still with that east-southeast flow, but drier, the main moisture now kind of linking up with the remnants of that front along the west coast there. Southwest Bristol Bay. Togiak, just a chance of some moisture. A little bit better chance for the Alaska Peninsula, but amounts will be quite light. And then the next system there south of the Aleutians through tomorrow be light winds and dry for the Aleutians, but then rain moves in tomorrow evening, overnight tomorrow night, and an increase in the winds out of the northeast. Could be gale force on Friday for the far western Aleutians. Otherwise, windy and wet for the central and eastern Aleutians. Heaviest precipitation, Adak and Atka. Lighter amounts, more intermittent there for the Fox Islands, with fairly light winds actually, and even the Pribilofs, and some areas of snow showers over the Yukon Delta and along and north and northwest of the Yukon River over the northwest part of the state on up to the western Arctic coast. And high pressure continuing to weaken, and but holding there over the Northwest Territories, kind of sliding southward into British Columbia, and that's going to allow some moisture to work northward into southern Cook Inlet and western Prince William Sound, or southern Prince William Sound, maybe Resurrection Bay. Seward, chance of rain or snow, possibly Seldovia, maybe Homer. Definitely Kodiak Island looks wet on Friday. And for the lows tonight, 30 to 40 for the Panhandle, near zero in the Copper River Basin, and upper 30s, mid to upper 30s, Bristol Bay, lower 40s for Kodiak Island, 20s south central Alaska. Highs tomorrow, 35 to 42 south central Alaska, and upper 30s to upper 40s for the Panhandle, mid 40s Kodiak Island, lower 40s for King Salmon, and around 10 for Golcana, 17 for McGrath, and lows a shade below zero in the higher valleys of the Copper River Basin, otherwise in the 20s for the Susitna, Manduska Valley, Kenai Peninsula, mid-20s to mid-30s for the Panhandle, mild for Kodiak Island, and in the 30s for Bristol Bay, highs in the lower 40s. Bristol Bay, upper 40s Kodiak, and upper 30s northern Panhandle, warmer to the south. Moving up to the north, lows below zero, central and northeast interior, but a lot milder for the north slope and Arctic coast with that mild southwest flow. And highs mid-30s for the western and central Arctic coast, upper 30s down to the Seward Peninsula. Lows staying on the below zero side for the eastern interior, but much milder out to the west, 25 to 30. Same thing for the Arctic coast. Highs, single numbers, eastern interior, mid-30s Arctic coast and the Seward Peninsula. Southwest coast, lower 30s tonight, otherwise 30s to near 40 for the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians. Highs.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Flying weather for Thursday morning, some IFR over the Yukon Flats, otherwise central eastern interior, nothing but VFR, all the way up to the Arctic coast and north slope, some marginal VFR for the western Brooks Range, Seward Peninsula, Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, down to Togiak and Dillingham. Marginal VFR is slipping up into southern Cook Inlet, Kamishak Bay, and the southern Kenai Peninsula, including Kodiak Island. Otherwise, VFR for the North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, all the way down across the Panhandle to Dixon Entrance. IFR from the Bering Strait to St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta Coast, Nunivak Island to the Pribilofs, and the south coast of the Alaska Peninsula to Sitkinak. And for the afternoon, marginal VFR for the Yukon Flats, conditions slowly improve there, and VFR for south central Alaska, central eastern interior. Some marginal VFR now dropping into the central Arctic coast, and IFR Bering Strait, St. Lawrence Island, into the Yukon Delta down to Makoriak, and mostly marginal VFR for the Aleutians, and again IFR on the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula up to about Sitkinak Island, and VFR for the Panhandle and the North Gulf Coast. That continues into Friday morning with VFR, Central Eastern Interior, North Gulf Coast, Panhandle, IFR again for the Yukon Flats, and IFR for the West Coast. There's a remnants of that front pushes in, and right along Point Hope, Cape Lisburne, marginal VFR, Central Western Arctic Coast, and now pushing eastward across the Selawik, Kobuk Valley, Noatak Valley areas, much of the Bering Sea marginal with IFR for the West Central Aleutians. And for the afternoon Friday, IFR extends from the Brooks Range southwestward along the lower Yukon River Valley area to the southwest coast. And for the Alaska Peninsula, on Alaska Island, IFR near Atka westward to Shimian Attu. Marginal VFR now possibly pushing into Resurrection Bay and possibly Kachemak Bay, more likely though Kamishak Bay, Kodiak Island, maybe into southern Prince William Sound, but staying VFR for the Panhandle, eastern, southeast interior as well. And Atuvik, VFR tomorrow, same forecast for Adigan. Western Western Alaska Range, VFR for both Lake Clark and Merrill. Rainy, VFR. Windy, VFR as well. Isabel, VFR. Mentasta, VFR. Antonita, VFR. Portage, VFR flying there. And for Chilkoot and White, VFR, freezing levels 10,000 feet over south central Alaska, Anchorage, Palmer, including Prince William Sound due to upper level high pressure, and about 6,000 feet for the Panhandle. Cooler air mass out over the Aleutians, 2,000 to 4,000 feet there, but you can see that extends up to the western Arctic coast. Icing, not much of a threat, maybe some areas of isolated moderate rime icing northwest coast, pushing into Kotzebue Sound, back across Norton Sound, and down to the western Aleutians. Otherwise icing free elsewhere in Alaska. And for the jet stream, south flow 90 to 115 knots along the Yukon Delta coast, southwest 100 knots for the northwest coast, pretty light under high pressure for the Panhandle as well as the eastern interior. Aleutians not bad there, 70 knots for the northwest Bering Sea, 9,000 feet. Showing upper or low pressure over the Russian Far East, and then the high over the eastern border there. So gradient between the two systems there, creating some pretty strong southerly winds, 55 knots St. Lawrence Island, and about 70 knots through the Bering Strait into the southeastern Chukchi Sea, and south 50 knots along the southwest coast, and lighter winds over the eastern interior. Aleutians, pretty light winds in the southwest Bering Sea, looking light windwise there. And for 3,000 feet, again, strongest winds up along the northwest coast, western Arctic coast, up to 55 knots from the southwest there, about 40 knots there for St. Lawrence Island into the western Seward Peninsula, and then another wind max over Kamishak Bay there into the southern Kuskokwim Valley at about 55 knots, and 40 knots across the Alaska Peninsula. Light winds over the eastern interior and the North Gulf Coast, as well as the Panhandle. And for turbulence, look for considerable moderate chop for the western interior from the Brooks Range southward to Bristol Bay, including Kodiak Island, as well as St. Lawrence Island.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, joined once again by the science liaison of GINA, Eric Stevens. GINA, of course, is the Geographic Information Network of Alaska, based up at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And GINA is all about satellites, and Eric is always here to tell some really cool stuff about satellites. Now, the last time you were here, we talked about how the weather satellites can see clouds and what's under the clouds, but you're telling me that satellites can do a lot more, even protect the general public with aviation safety information.
That's right. There's one particular aspect of satellites we're going to talk about today that might not be immediately obvious, and that is detecting things in the atmosphere that are not clouds, that are not snow, not rain, but rather a hazard that can happen here in Alaska, and that is volcanic ash.
Of course.
When a volcano goes off, puts ash in the air, this is of course a hazard to the public if the ash were to fall on the ground in accumulating amounts.
Sure.
Additionally, while the ash is in the air, and this is the more frequent hazard, is it's a hazard to aviation, because you cannot fly an airplane into volcanic ash without great risk. Worst case scenario, the ash gets into a jet engine, wrecks the engine, kills the engine, and now you have an airplane flying with no engines. It won't fly for long. So aviators need to avoid that ash. How do you avoid the ash? You have to know where it is by identifying it with a satellite image and perhaps predicting then where the ash will flow with the overall weather patterns. Satellites are so important for identifying when a volcano goes off and then tracking the ash after the volcano injects the ash into the atmosphere.
Now, are you talking about seeing the heat signature or a huge volcanic plume with a cloud that we're used to seeing in the really pretty pictures of any Alaska volcano that's erupted recently? Readout, for example, or are we talking about the really fine details? Because this is polar orbiting satellites, the ones that are very low to the ground, right?
The geostationary satellites can do some detection. The polar orbiters, like you say, they're closer to the Earth. They give the even better view. In answer to your question, I would say all of the above.
Oh, okay.
A heat signature from a volcano going off with all the heat that comes with the eruption, that can be identified in infrared imagery.
Okay.
We've got images from the Kamchatka Peninsula. That's the far eastern part of Russia on the western side of the Bering Sea, loaded with volcanoes.
Right.
You know, Alaska has plenty of volcanoes of its own. We can also be affected when a volcano goes off in Kamchatka, say, and then the weather carries that ash toward Alaska from the west.
Right.
You can see the infrared heat signature, like you say. Also, the ash in the air can be detected by doing some sophisticated channel differencing within the satellite data. You can find the identification of sulfur dioxide, say, that's a component of the volcanic emission, and you can trace this with the satellite imagery. Sometimes volcanoes go off that haven't gone off before, and we're not expecting them to go off. Say if there's no seismometers around a given volcano that hasn't gone off in 100 years, you might not be expecting it to go off in the satellite imagery. Since satellites can be globally comprehensive, that might be the first sign that you have that a volcano in an unexpected area is going off.
So it's a good backup system. Okay.
Right.
Wow.
Right. And people are working all the time on automating the interrogation of satellite data by computers to provide a first alert to a human, so the software will say, we think this might be important. Human, go take a closer look. Because the people are still the best way to interrogate the imagery, but the planet's a big place, and we can't be looking everywhere all the time, so the software helps give a first cut. And then in Alaska, there's a special kind of surprise angle where the satellites are helpful, and that is the Katmai eruption of 1912. Huge eruption. There is still somewhat of a moonscape out there in southwest Alaska where all this ash is laying on the ground. And sometimes a strong weather pattern comes along where we have roaring northwest winds that go across the Alaska Peninsula there and can actually pick some of this ash up off the ground. No volcano is going off. This was more than 100 years ago that volcano actually blew. So you're not going to see a heat signature like we were discussing. There will be no seismic signature of a volcano going off. So those data sets, they'll say, oh, no problem. But you can see in some of the satellite imagery this ash, as it's called, resuspended. When the wind comes along, picks it up, the ash can be lofted a few thousand feet in the air just with the wind. And an airplane flying into that plume is exposed to some danger. So we need to track that ash to provide guidance to aviators that you don't want to be flying here at these elevations in this area. We've got some imagery of the resuspension, and you can see the wind blowing strongly from the northwest, picking up the ash and blowing it down to the southeast. And so that's another, perhaps not immediately obvious hazard of volcanic ash. Katmai is the gift that keeps on giving, for sure.
Very good. So we've got satellites that can help us understand the weather from the past and the immediate past. And we talked last time about how that's feeding into the forecast modeling to help improve predictions. But now they're also protecting the general public with aviation-sensitive information and watching volcanoes, whether they're erupting or maybe have erupted in the past, and finding the left-behinds from those volcanic events there. So really impressive stuff. Eric, thanks so much for joining us again today. And you're a gift that keeps on giving from the satellite community, so thanks a lot, and we hope to have you back again soon. Again, Eric Stevens with Gina at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And if you'd like to check out any of the information that Eric has shared with us again today, you can do that very easily by going to www.gina.alaska.edu. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, and thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
And moving on to coastal water forecast. Along the south coast of the Panhandle, east winds 20 knots. And for the north coast, looking at east and northeast winds 10 to 20 knots, 6 to 7 foot seas. Lynn Canal, north winds 25 knots with higher gusts. Stevens Passage, winds will be northeast at 20 knots with 4 foot seas. And for Clarence Strait, north winds 20 knots. And for Friday, north winds 20 knots for the central and northern inside waters with 4 foot seas, and east at about 15 for Clarence Strait. For the south coast, southeast winds 30 to 35 knots, seas 10 to 12 feet in the north coast, east southeast winds at 30 knots with 9 to 10 foot seas. And for Prince William Sound, north winds at 10 knots for the day Thursday, seas at about 2 feet. And for the North Gulf Coast, east and northeast winds 20 to 25 knots, and seas generally under 10 feet. And for Barren Islands, east winds 30 knots, seas 9 feet. Kamishak Bay, northeast winds at 30 with 10-foot seas. And southern Cook Inlet, a small craft advisory, northeast winds 25 knots, but north of the Forelands, northeast at 20 with 5-foot seas. And for Friday, for Cook Inlet, northeast winds 15 to 20 knots with 4 to 6 foot seas. Prince William Sound, winds will be east at 20 knots. And for the North Gulf Coast and Barren Islands, east-northeast winds at 30 knots with 11 to 13 foot seas. Kamishak Bay, northeast winds 25 knots. And for Shelikof Strait Thursday, gale warnings for northeast winds 35 knots, east 25 on the east side of Kodiak Island, and variable to northeast winds for the Alaska Peninsula at 25 knots. Bristol Bay, east winds 25 knots, seas 7 feet. For Friday, northeast winds 30 knots for Kodiak Island and Fognak Island and the surrounding areas, with seas 11 to 13 feet, and then east-northeast winds 20 to 30 knots for the Alaska Peninsula, northeast winds 20 knots for Bristol Bay. Eastern Aleutians, variable to south winds at 10 to 15 knots Thursday. Central Aleutians, variable winds 10 to 15 knots. East winds 20 knots on Sitka Island and northeast at 25 from Kiska to Shimia. And for Friday, western Aleutians, gale warnings for northeast winds increasing to 35 knots, seas building to 15 feet. Northeast winds at 30 knots there for the west central Aleutians, Adak and Atka. East winds 25 knots, 7 to 12 foot seas. Eastern Aleutians, north to northeast winds 15 to 20 knots with 6 to 10 foot seas. And for the southwest coast on Thursday, small craft advisories, southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. For St. Paul and St. George, south winds at 20 knots, south at 30 for St. Matthew Island. Gale warnings for St. Lawrence Island, southerlies at 40 knots with 14-foot seas. And for the day Friday, Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, light northerly winds, no more than 10 knots, seas running 3 to 7 feet, and northeast winds at 20 knots for the Yukon Delta coast, east 25 knots, Kuskokwim Delta coast, Pribilofs northeast at 15 knots, and St. Matthew Island, north winds at 20 knots. Central Arctic coast, south winds 20 knots. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast, southwest at 20 knots. Gale warnings for the western Arctic coast for south winds 35 to 45 knots. And for the southeast Chukchi Sea, southeast winds at 40 knots. Then for Friday, western Arctic coast, small craft advisories, west winds 25 to 30 knots, and the central Arctic coast looking at southwest winds at 30 knots with seas as high as 12 feet. And then brisk wind advisories for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, east winds 25 knots. And for tonight again, a high wind warning continues through tonight and into tomorrow. St. Lawrence Island, Bering Strait coast, the northwest coast, and Seward Peninsula area, and the western Arctic coast for winds gusting to 70 miles an hour, with areas of blowing snow, higher elevations of the western Brooks Range possible, and rain and snow into the southwest interior. Rain becoming a little more showery for Kodiak Island, and a weakening front keeps it wet over the central Aleutians, edging in toward the eastern Aleutians. Strong high pressure, dry conditions, windy conditions for the northern panhandle, and a little less in the way of wind for the southeast coast, but still a lot of clear skies, cool temperatures, and dry over the eastern central interior, picking up the clouds as you head west there. Rain and snow along that weakening front along the west coast. Southern Bering Sea looking really good, but then that system pushes northward, brings rain and wind into the Aleutians on Friday, and areas of snow showers all over the western and northwest interior, mostly along and northwest of the Yukon River. Otherwise, chance of rain.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.